Harry. Esquentei a mufa, escrevi um artigo pro Estadão, que saiu hoje.
Eu vi.
Tá até bonitinho, ficou até bonitinho o artigo. Não sei se vai ser popular, porque eu relogiei o artigo do Eugênio Butti, que saiu ontem. Você viu ou não?
Não.
Aí eu botei, falou, pessoal, lê isso aqui que é importante. Bom artigo dele. Aí o pessoal, não, ele disse que ela é honesta. Eu não acho que é. Parece, não sei, quer dizer, se ela não for honesta também, nós temos.
No kidding. Oh, extreme right. This is hyperbole. What is it called?
All right.
Go up into infinity.
That's true. Peter, may I go ahead and put this microphone
Sure.
on with, if you'd like to state one?
However you, I mean, I don't think, is this being filmed?
Yes.
Oh, then it has to be hidden.
Try to do our best. We're going to stream it on the internet. I'll put just a little piece of tape back on this one.
There, but
Tá vendo?
yeah.
Carol, this is on
Joaquim, você já tinha
the video.
Armado.
Is it on? The live stream?
Yes.
Are we good to go? Yeah?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
How are you? Nice to see you.
You didn't notice.
Huh?
You did not notice
Hey, João.
our redness.
Yes. 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 See? Look at this. See?
João,
No political statement.
Introduce to the president.
come. Join us.
Yes.
I have to get something.
Well,
I just have to get
Como
something.
estamos hoje?
Ok.
Nosso percentual.
Tenta.
Está estável, né?
Com viagem alta, realmente vai.
okay. Well, good morning. Happy 2016 to all of you. Welcome to the Wilson Center, to you and those also who are following these proceedings live on the web. And there are I understand there's a number of people with us from Brazil and from other places. As you know, this will be another very challenging year for Brazilians. As the title of the topic that the event suggests. I thank you for your interest in Brazil. I am particularly grateful to the friends that joined us here this morning on stage to share their views on the problems and the possibilities the crisis presents to Brazil. Otaviano Canuto, Brazil's Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund. Teresa Terminacian, former Director of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department and an expert on Brazil's economy. Peter Haken, President Emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue and also an expert on Brazil. Mauricio Moura, Director of the polling firm Ideia Inteligência. Mônica de Bolt, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. João Augusto de Castro Neves, Director for Latin American at Eurasia. We have 4 Brazilians and 2 Americans on stage.
Italian.
This story. Yes, even better. We have an American and an Italian for Brazil. For time's sake, I won't read the biographical notes that we prepared about our speakers, so it's available there, and you can read those. Just a few points about the crisis before asking Mauricio Moura to set the stage for us, for our conversation, by presenting findings of opinion polls he developed with Monica's help and ran in the past 2 weeks. Last year's recession is expected to continue, although hopefully at a slower pace, making, nevertheless, this the longest contraction of Brazil's economy in almost a century. The political crisis is unresolved, although we believe it's going to be resolved under the rule of law in democracy. President Dilma Rousseff remains highly unpopular, but is unlikely to be impeached by Congress. The Superior Electoral Tribunal, however, could still nullify her election and that of Vice President Michel Temer. Brazilians are quite realistic about the situation they confront, but continue to be optimistic, maybe unreasonably so, about their personal lives, the impact of the crisis in their personal lives. Voters' support for the ongoing investigations on corruption remains very, very high, and probably going higher compared to a poll that Mauricio ran some couple months ago. This will certainly, on a lighter note, become evident in the upcoming carnival. The most popular carnival mask this year is that of the japonês da Federal. He is a federal police officer frequently seen in the past year arresting dozens of VIPs in Brazil accused of crimes of corruption. There is a music that goes with the mask. Aware of that public opinion remains quite aware and supportive of corruption investigations. President Rousseff used her first press conference just the other day to carefully signal her support to Operação Lava Jato. In an effort to restore her lost authority, the President has also started to acknowledge the mistakes that her government made in the conduct of economic policy. She is now surrounded by advisors, handpicked by former President Lula, and has also indicated political willingness to pick fights with her own Workers' Party and with unions close to the PT in order to advance structural reforms. We will obviously talk about that. The crisis has made the government start also to distance itself from some aspects of foreign policy that were very influenced by the preferences of the Workers' Party, especially in the region and especially in Venezuela. We have already seen evidence of that. Well, I will stop here and I will ask first Mauricio to start us off by
Plug in the battery.
doing. Michael, can you fix this, please? And present the findings of his the polls he ran, and obviously his also analysis of these polls, and then we will continue. I will then invite, in the order, Otaviano, Teresa, Peter, Monica, and João Augusto, and then we will have a discussion with all of you. Thank you very much.
I just moved to avoid that my long hair might,
Okay. No,
A lot of hair.
Yeah, I think it's so good.
yeah, we can watch it
Yeah.
from there.
Morning.
This way.
Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you. Oh.
Where is it?
So this is the forecast for the Brazilian economy.
It disappeared.
Oh, that's
We do have a
So
That's
I
a
see
blank
lights.
screen.
Huh?
There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, there is lights here.
Another train coming.
It's a Chinese-made computer, doesn't it? Yes, it doesn't work.
It was basically the battery.
It was there until moments ago.
No, the battery was.
What is it? Hmm? Here?
So we need renewable energy.
The crisis is serious. Really? We ran out of power.
Oh, Peter.
Washington. Man,
That's the convergence between the U.S.
awful.
and that's
see,
Start having to have power outages here in the U.S. Oh.
hallelujah.
Let me stay quiet.
Oh. So good morning. Yesterday, President Dilma had a breakfast with the press. I was always wondering why the press got breakfast and the Brazilians get no free lunch. No? So, she told to the press, they said that 2016 will be a remarkable year. That was quoting President Dilma. And so.
It continues not to work. I told you it was going to be a difficult year.
We're going to. So, first question that I'm going to present three surveys. The first two surveys are telephone surveys that we run in the last week of last year, and another telephone survey that we ran actually in 2016, the first week. And the third one is a survey, but it's not like a statistical survey. I shoot some questions by WhatsApp to congressmen and senators, and they came back with answers, so I'm going to present that. First, I got a good picture of President Dilma, and I told Teresa and Monica to come in red to make a tribute to her. So this is the first survey. First question: do you believe 2016 will be, to Brazil as a country, would be better, would be worse, or would be the same? So 40% of the people think it would be worst. 35% are with Dilma, think it'd be better. I don't know if it's remarkable, but would be better. Last year, it was the other way around. 45% of people thought that 2015 would be better than 2014. So this year, people are more pessimistic. Talking about the economy itself, then it's kind of 70% of the people think 2016 will be worst compared to 2015. that for the first time people are agreeing with the economists about forecasting things. So, and that was I heard the other day a good thing. I'm an economist as well, and one of the economists said, "We don't make forecasts because we want. We make forecasts because you ask to do." So that's what we ask people, and there is a huge pessimism about the economy in 2016. How about the politics? Politics is losing by a very small margin to the economy, but it's still a very pessimistic scenario. I thought we got the worst of politics in 2015, but be ready that things could be worse. Imagine, in 2015 we had a Congress in Brazil that the President of the Senate and the President of the House were being investigated in a scandal of corruption. And almost 10% of the people in the Congress would be investigated as well. So it's kind of a unique scenario. In your personal opinion, President Dilma, government, will be able to make your life better in 2016? About 80% said no, they're not going to be able to make my life better. I think Professor Friedman from University of Chicago would be very proud of saying that. He once quoted me that said that no government makes life people better. So this is kind of going in that direction. But there is a hope. That's the best thing about. When you talk about your personal life, do you think 2016 would be a better year?
That's Brazil.
So that's 65%
Carnival has
are very optimistic about the personal life. Maybe they are like soccer fans of a good team, not the case of Fabiano Sino, of course.
Corinthians, yes.
And but maybe we run the survey during the New Year's time in Brazil, and everybody has the hope that between December 31st and January 1st everything changes. So maybe, but I got a quote from Gilberto Gil, former Minister of Culture and very famous singer, that he once said that Brazilians are by definition happy and screwed. So that's the combination of the survey. We got a second survey that was run in 2016, this week, beginning of this week, by telephone as well. And we asked, based on our personal knowledge, who is the current Minister of Finance? About 58% said they don't know. And I was talking to a colleague of mine from the university here, and they said probably in the United States, people, 60% don't know who is the U.S. Treasury Secretary as well.
Yeah.
So that's not a, and he told me that in the US, the President of the Central Bank is much more known than the Minister of Finance or the Treasury Secretary. But there are still people thinking that Guido Mantega is the Minister of Finance. So that's
People still
right.
think that.
And Joaquim Levy, so some people were not told that Levy left in the end of last year. But we have 20% of very well-informed people that read Monica's and Paulo's articles in the paper. No, Nelson Barbosa is the... I didn't put the option Joaquim Barbosa. That would be another option. That would be a good combination. But only for those who knows, the 20% that knows about the Nelson Barbosa, do you think the Brazilian economy are better off, worse off, or the same with Nelson Barbosa as the head of the economy? And they say worst, 62% they are more pessimistic about Nelson Barbosa. That should be a selection bias that people that know don't like him. But anyway. And I tried the following sentence. Lava Jato investigation, please, does jeopardize the Brazilian economic recovery? There is last year, President Dilma commented that she had the idea that the Lava Jato was hurting the economy, and 65% disagree with that. So they don't think the issue of the economic recovery is based on the Lava Jato. But we also asked it, would you support the Lava Jato investigation suspension if that could improve the Brazilian economic situation?
That's amazing.
That's a huge no, and that's a huge support for the investigation itself. And I have to say that President Dilma is a huge supporter of the investigation. She highlights that every single time she talks to the press. So it's not something that the government itself is not supporting. I was about to say about the Japanese from the federal police, but Paulo stole my my comments. But last month we run a survey for presidential elections from one of our clients, and we had this spontaneous question that we don't give options to the respondents. Who do you think could be the next president? Who would you vote for? And Japanese from Federal Police got 2%. So he's becoming a superstar on the. But also Pope Francis got 2% as well. So that's.
All right.
And that question I made for Teresa, for Otaviano, for Monica, because we know the good work that IMF does globally. And do you think that Brazil need IMF support in 2016? So that's a very tight race. So 45% yes, 46% no. I don't know if people fully understand what does it mean about IMF support, but that was the question. And only for those who think Brazil will need IMF support, after the IMF support, the Brazil can be worse off. And I always, I've never told this to an IMF official, but if the IMF really believe that they're doing a good job, they should hire a public relations firm. Because every country that I go, people think that life is worse than IMF. So, last year, President Dilma told us that this CPMF is the tax on financial transactions. And she said CPMF is the only way to balance the budget. So what we did, we sent, we asked the congressmen, congresswomen, and the senators. We sent questions by cellular phone, specifically by WhatsApp. Some people claim that they pay much more attention to the cellular phone than to the sessions itself. I don't know, João worked there, can tell me more. I have a very funny story about last year on the senator in the Congress. You know, they shut down access to porno sites in the Congress. And everybody complained. So it's but they changed it, they came back. Then now everything is open, a lot of transparency there. But anyway, we shoot a poll by WhatsApp, I have to say here that I didn't have any intention to do a sampling, to do any statistical distribution. It was just a matter of sending the question to all of funds that we had, that was almost 100%. And the answers that came back was 188 congressmen and House members and 25 senators. It was funny because this was in the week that Delcidio Amaral went to prison. So my sample got reduced in that week, but anyway, I still sent to. So first question, do you believe that the House Senate will approve the recreation of the CPMF 2016? They sound pessimistic about that, but I have to tell you that I myself, and then I want to hear my colleagues as well, I think that this is going to be approved in 2016, not because of the government ability to interact with the Congress, but because all the state governments, they need the CPMF. So that's kind of a survival issue. So I believe that this doesn't reflect what's going to happen. Another question do you vote and approve the minimal retirement age? This is a critical issue to increase the minimum age to retire, and that will tackle the pension dynamics that's hurting the Brazilian finances. Then all the economists here can comment on that. Do you think they will vote and approve the minimum wage indexation? So that's another important topic. They're very pessimistic about that. And this is a very interesting question. All those last questions that I mentioned, they have bills being discussed in the House. This question, there is no bill actually in that time being discussed at all, but they are very optimistic about approving a flexibility on the labor laws. And that has one reason from the ones that I talked to. There's a lot of pressure right now in unemployment in Brazil, so if you talk to any congressman or congresswoman, now they know that in their states, people are suffering with employment. So this is something that unites them, but actually in practice, there is no bill that reflects that. But anyway, they were more optimistic on that. And last question that I asked, do you believe that President will finish her term in office? So they are said yes. Of course, the no's come from the opposition, whatever the opposition is at that moment. And so there are two things in Brazil that are hard to follow, the stock market and who is the coalition in the Congress. So at that moment, and I firmly believe that as of today, and I want to hear João on that, it's going to be very unlikely that the opposition has the votes to go through the impeachment process. So I think as of today, the impeachment is very unlikely from the Congress. Not on the methods of the step-by-step, this impeachment step-by-step process, but only the votes. So with that, with the things that basically in summary saying that economy is going to be worse, politics is terrible. I don't know who is the Minister of Finance, but my life is going to be better. No? Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Just one thing that I failed to mention, although there is a crisis of leadership that is evident, but it's not a crisis of leadership that involves the government. It is the government and the opposition. Okay? People do not see in the among Brazilian politicians who could run the place. And this is an important consideration. With that, I would like to invite Otaviano to come there or here, whatever you prefer.
I will stand, it's better.
Okay, and to present his views on 2016. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Paulo, to be here with such a fantastic panel. And caveats, obviously, disclaimer. I speak on my own behalf, not on behalf of the institution where I'm part of the board. It's my talk. I can't avoid the fact that I'm representative of Brazil and not in 10 other countries at the board, but I'm speaking on my own. I would also like to note in advance the elegance of our two companions. But probably they will also give the disclaimer that the color that they chose has nothing to do with it.
I said Republican.
What I like to highlight here is two set of observations. One on the nature of the deep growth deceleration in Brazil, and in order to make possible to understand the second part of my comments, that will be on the economic policy. I see, and I affirm continuity of views of economic policy, particularly since the beginning of 2015. There was a structural break in the view of what to do in terms of economic policy in Brazil, coming from the president. There were even signals that such a re-steering of the economic policy was thought in many aspects already back in 2013, but then the election process ended up postponing this adjustment. But the fact is that there is a continuity on a certain view of what's to be done, and this policy has been at play since the beginning of last year, with shortcomings, with adjustments, with adaptations. But the change in leadership, I guess the population saw it quite clearly. It's not that they don't know who's the Minister of Finance. Maybe it's matter less, exactly the personality of who's there. And I can affirm that there is no intention to exist any sort of breakdown in the directions of the economic policy with the change of positions as the Minister of Finance. My friend Joaquim Levy, who invited me to be where I am, and who is the future CFO of the World Bank Group. Now, the growth deceleration in Brazil cannot be understood without taking into account at least 4 layers of determinants. Sometimes the presence of these 4 layers gets blurred because of the political dispute inside Brazil, which makes, depending on where you are vis-a-vis the government, to highlight one of those four. But the fact is, I don't believe one can understand the nature of the Brazilian crisis, economic crisis, without taking into account each one of the four layers that I'm going to summarize here. First of all, there has been a structural growth deceleration in Brazil for long. It was clearly at play back in 2008, 2009, and which is the exhaustion on some of the structural determinants of growth in Brazil. And the fact is that if the economy did not feature deceleration in previous years, it was because of the second layer of determinants of growth and crisis coming from abroad. Namely the good state of the commodity price and financial conditions and so on, the positive external scenario that is well known, that helped the Brazilian economy to undergo an additional breath of growth in the previous years, but also which came to an exhaustion, as we all know, after the global financial crisis. If there was, of course, the reason why the second layer of determinants, up and down, did not come to the fore, it was because there was a second life, as we all know, of the emerging markets growth, China, and also until exhausting more recently. For now, this is the fifth year in which the growth of the emerging markets as a group has diminished, and we may be on the verge of an additional round of turbulence, as we have notes in what's happening with the Chinese economy and so on. But the fact is that this second round, the second life during the dream of the with respect to the decoupling, the dream of decoupling of emerging markets, also provided us a new breath, a second burst, a second period of life in the Brazilian growth that was already in the cards of exhaustion. A third layer of determinants, of course, has to do with the economic policy response in Brazil, the overuse of counter-cyclical policies that came to be called as new economic matrix. I must say something. Any close observer of the inner functioning of the Minister of Finance, I wasn't associated with the government, but I know, and I've been watching it, there was no such a thing as a new economic matrix as a model. That was a very fancy tag associated to what was more the result of the outcome of chaotic process of policies pursued by different parts of the Ministry of Finance. But it's a good one because it summarized, let's say, all the items that were to play as a sort of a second counter-cyclical policies, which have been recognized, acknowledged by President Dilma herself as having been an exaggeration. But they ceased to be effective, as we all know, and left a bad legacy in terms of additional fiscal challenges, and this is quite important because the economic policy of 2015 has to be understood as the unwinding of those counter-cyclical policies followed particularly in the years of 2012 and 2013 and 2014. And the fourth layer of determinants, which are more current ones, has to do, is not Lava Jato but it has nothing to do with being in favor or against Lava Jato, but it's a statement of fact. As it would have happened in any other market economy, at least that I know, a real market economy, we have watched a disruption for good reasons, of the prevailing market structures in all the sectors in Brazil where there is a strong interaction with the public sector. And this is a consequence in the aftermath of Lava Jato for a good reason, because the immediate result has been the dismantling, the disruption of a very stable cartel-like market structure, which provides me the chance to establish here a good silver lining for Brazil in the future, namely, because as the result of Lava Jato and the ensuing market adjustment, the market structure adjustment in these sectors, we are bound to see more competition in the private sector than in the past, and we're bound to also have, as the outcome, a better cost effectiveness outcome of coming from the public sector, because there will be less toll to be charged on the private sector side. And also, hopefully, the perception of rule of law in Brazil will be improved, which is something that matters among the determinants of private investment, both from foreigners and from inside. I will not establish here what is the weight of each one of these layers in explaining the 4% acceleration of 2015 and whatever be the negative forecast for GDP this year. But the fact is that, you establish weight on this, you put the blame on the lousy economic policy, the third layer that I mentioned, or you put the weight on the external factors if you want to exempt the government. But I leave it to the taste of the analyst, because quantitatively no one has been able so far to establish due accounting of what each one of these four determines. Economic policy, I'm running to the end. 2015, everything that was tentatively implemented in 2015 can be accounted for as the unwinding of the counter-cyclical, the new economic matrix. And part of this program of unwinding has been successfully implemented. The speed with which regulated prices were adjusted in the beginning of the year surprised many analysts. The recovery of the price of energy and so on. The second price realignment, which has been the exchange rate depreciation, has also happened, not as an outcome, a result of economic policy decision, but as part of the adjustment. The freedom, as expected as well, of the monetary policy to respond to the price shock in order to make sure that the expectations regarding inflation would be favorable in 2016 has also been implemented. The fourth component of this unwinding of the new economic matrix has only been half implemented, which is the fiscal policy. It's a matter of degree, but not of direction when it comes to the fiscal adjustment. This was when Joaquin Levy was called. This is what is going to happen and be maintained with Nelson Barbosa, as reaffirmed by President Dilma herself. As for the structural reform agenda, which would be dealing with long term, I guess one should take seriously the signals given by President Dilma, by Chief of Staff, on the high priority that will be attributed to the pension reform. It was reaffirmed yesterday in the interview. And on the adjustment of labor market regulations, so as to allow for the prevalence of agreements over the rigidity of the law. One has to, I think one should take off the noise associated with any expected drastic change in the economic policy followed by President Dilma, because whoever bets on that, I would say, is bound to lose. And I will take back on the other topics later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ottaviano. I just wanted to remind people of one, since you mentioned Joaquin Levy many times, and I hope he's watching this, but remotely. But there is one phrase that Joaquin Levy said in March 16th of last year after huge street demonstrations all over Brazil. And he was interviewed, I think, at Federação de Comércio, and he said something that caught my attention. And I think it's relevant, especially in light of what you said, is that state capitalism does not work very well in democracy. I think this is a very hopeful statement, because since I believe that we are not giving up democracy in Brazil, something else has to give. And so think about that. I think it's a very important remark by Joaquin Levy. With that, I would like to bring first Teresa Terminacion to offer her perspective. The next two speakers are going to give us a perspective from an international view of the crisis in Brazil, and then we'll bring it back to perspective of Brazilians. So, Teresa.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you, Paolo, for inviting me to this interesting seminar. Obviously, in 10 minutes or so, and actually Paolo said even less, I can't do justice to the subject. So I'll start with telling you a little bit my bottom line, and then we can go on with, during the question and answer with more specifics on every one of the aspects that I have covered. Now, President Dilma, according to, I believe, the Financial Times, acknowledged a few days ago that 2015 was a difficult year. Well, unfortunately, 2016 is unlikely to be significantly better, at least on average. If you compare, let's say, growth of GDP or decline of GDP in 2016 on average, and perhaps even on the inflation rate. But depending on policies, one may see during the year either a beginning of an improvement or of a slide towards crisis. I think the first half of the year, in my view, is likely to continue to be dominated by the political uncertainties associated with the impeachment process, with investigations by the Tribunal Electoral, and the further fallout of the Lava Jato that seems every day to bring some new bad news for the government. These uncertainties are likely to affect deeply the economy, and I will go very quickly through the main channels through which they will affect. Assuming that the political uncertainties are largely resolved by mid-year, and this may be an optimistic assumption, the outlook for the rest of 2016, and especially for 2017 and beyond, will be very much affected by the evolution of policies. And in this sense, there are different scenarios possible, and that's what I will talk a little bit about. I leave to everyone to decide what's the relative probability that they attach to each scenario. I have my own priors, and perhaps we can discuss those a little bit. But it is true that this is very difficult objectively to assess the probability of one or other scenario. First of all, the effects of the political uncertainties on the real economy. So the first few months of 2016, and could be more than the first few months, depending on how the political environment evolves, are likely to see, first of all, a continued fall in private consumption, reflecting further, fears of further rises in unemployment, and also, let's not forget, the heavy burden of household debt, which with the high interest rates has become much more burdensome. Second, no recovery on private investment, probably in fact a further decline as a result of very low business confidence, high levels of unutilized capacity, and tight credit conditions. Consequently, we are going to see a further decline in output and a further rise in unemployment. There will be, in my view, only limited progress on inflation, despite the weakness of demand, because of the lingering effects of the recent increases in administered prices and the depreciation of the exchange rate, which has not yet been fully passed through. The improvement, I mean, the one bright spot will be the external side, at least on the current account and the trade balance, but this will continue to be driven more by falling imports rather than rising exports because of the weakness in external demand, especially in China, and the commodity prices. And FDI is unlikely to make a strong comeback. FDI has been moderately, has not fallen significantly, but it's unlikely with these uncertainties to become, to achieve the rates of the past. As regards the public finances, the government, unfortunately, will be under pressures to increase spending because there will be pressure to try to revive demand, to arrest the deterioration in the labor market, and to buy political support during the impeachment proceedings. It's difficult to say how much of an increase in spendings we will see. It will depend to some extent also on how market reactions and the effect of that on the economic policymakers and most of all on the president. Nevertheless, I think that the pressures will be there, and it will be subtle because typically these things don't go with great announcements, but more with slippages here and there. Also, the social security finances will be adversely impacted by the recent large increases in the minimum wage, 12% almost, and the spending on unemployment benefits will continue to rise. There will be, and I think importantly, growing pressure from state governors and from mayors of large cities, or some large cities, to obtain the Treasury authorization to resume borrowing, especially from abroad. It might be also necessary for the government to support some public enterprises. The worse than projected economic outlook also may lead to shortfalls in revenue compared with the recently passed 2016 budget, even if all the revenue-raising measures that have been proposed by the government are approved and implemented on schedule, which is a question mark. As a result, the primary balance will probably improve compared to the very bad results of this year, but will not improve as much as targeted. And even if the central bank does not raise further interest rates, interest payments on the growing stock of the public debt will continue to rise, although if there is no major new pressure on the exchange rate, the fiscal cost of the foreign exchange swap program may decline compared to the very high level that it reached, 90 billion in 2015. Therefore, the nominal deficit will remain very high. I mean, this year is likely to be more than 10% or around 10% of GDP. And the public debt will continue to rise as a ratio to GDP, possibly approaching 70%. Now, beyond what is the outlook for the second half of 2016, or let's say the latter part of the year and beyond? I think one can think of three different scenarios. One, a benevolent, I would say, scenario, a positive scenario where the government, whichever it might be, I tend to agree that it will probably be the same, is willing and able to initiate at least a serious and credible program of reforms, not only in the spending side, the social security, administrative, and other expenditure reforms, on the tax side, and in other structural policies, especially in the labor market, labor legislation, and in regulatory regimes. these reforms, if they would boost productivity and would boost confidence of investors and financial markets, and would facilitate a gradual but sustained decline in interest rates. Under this scenario, one could expect a gradual recovery of investment, especially in the tradable sector, and ultimately in output and employment. Inflation would decelerate, the current account would stabilize at a sustainable deficit, and the fiscal position would strengthen progressively, leading to a stabilization and ultimately a beginning of decline of the public debt. This positive scenario would help shelter Brazil from possible, I would say likely, external shocks, and substantially improve, of course, domestic welfare. There is, however, no guarantee, and this is, I would say, after I saw the results of the third poll of Mauricio, I would say there is little hope that the political consensus needed to adopt such reforms will materialize in the near term. So what are the possible other scenarios? Well, probably the most likely scenario is one of muddling through, with little reform, but some improvement in the mix of macroeconomic policies. I mean, some tightening of the fiscal stance, in part sort of reflecting the effects of the measures already initiated by the Joachim Levy and hopefully continued by his successor, and which would permit some modest easing of monetary policy. The exchange rate would continue to slide to avoid a renewed weakening of competitiveness. Under this scenario, GDP would recover only slowly, and it would remain clearly, the growth rate would be subpar compared to most other emerging markets. Unemployment would not fall significantly, and inflation would remain in the high single digits. The public debt would continue to rise as a ratio to GDP, but at a slower rate. Now, would such a scenario muddling through be sustainable over the longer term? That's an open question. First of all, there will be internal pressures because of the rise in unemployment to boost growth through fiscal stimulus. And also, and possibly more importantly, there will be mounting market concerns over the public debt dynamics. And so one could see down the road a transition to a third scenario, which is a scenario of outright crisis. How soon such a scenario would materialize is an open, of course, an open question. If in the next few months, and contrary to the expectations of Ottaviano, which I share, by the way, those who believe that fiscal stimulus or renewed fiscal stimulus is the way to go, where to gain the upper hand in the government, one would see further repeated downgrades, capital flight eventually, and large losses of external reserves. Under such a scenario, which I would call a scenario of crisis, GDP would decline further and inflation would start spiraling upwards. This scenario would take time probably to materialize because Brazil has substantial external buffers, I mean a large stock of reserves, but cannot be ruled out for the medium term in the absence of fiscal adjustment. So I would say this is not an optimistic scenario. I mean, let's say the prospects are not bright, but if the political environment evolves in a way that permits a clear, visible improvement in the policy stance, and not just in terms of short-term measures, but also measures that lead to a medium-term reform program, I think Brazil will get out of the current crisis. But it's very much an open question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And I would like to invite now Peter to offer also an international perspective, more from the on the political side of things. You want to speak from there, from here?
I was told I was given orders to sit here.
Okay. So, I am overruled.
Doctor, but by your doctor.
Yes. Go.
And I hope you can hear me because I got tangled up in the microphone and it got pulled off. But if anyone
Is
can
it
hear
okay?
me, is
Okay.
it okay? Okay, good. I guess my job is to talk optimistically, right? Because everybody
Your
else.
job is to talk freely.
But actually, Paolo Sotero, who I want to thank for inviting me, gave me the instructions, as I understood them, was to tell people how Washington thinks about Brazil's economic problems, its more general set of crises. And the problem is, Paolo, thinking about it, I don't get much of a sense of a view in Washington. My conversations about Brazil even are largely with the group sitting around the table. It's not that you go to the White House or you go to the State Department or the trade operations and you sort of sit down and sort of have a lengthy conversation. And certainly not on the subway either and the metro. So you're going to have to hear my view of it. Let me just start out by saying, I agree with the previous speakers. I'll put it a little simpler. Brazil is in a deep, deep mess.
Thank you, Peter.
And it's sort of challenging, doesn't get us anywhere near the set of problems that. And in fact, if I just went in and talked about the problems, I would take up more than the time you've allotted. So I'm going to try to just to leave it at that. You've heard about the economic situation. The corruption is awful. The sums involved, the level of the people involved, the party leaders, the sort of business leaders among Brazil's richest men and women are involved. I mean, this is an extraordinary sense of, and certainly that's an issue that's worthwhile to spend the whole day on. And again, I don't have the time now to spend the whole day on it.
I'll invite you back.
But I think the central problem is politics. I mean, that's where the core of this problem lies. Not so much that the politics generated the problem, but the lack of any effective response to it so far is really what one has to look at. And this is really a governance crisis, sort of political issues, leadership issues. This is Brazil's political order, if you like, or disorder, is really at the core. And a conversation yesterday with João sort of talked about it. That Brazil's politics are dysfunctional. They mentioned that the ideas are all out of date. The leadership is out of touch. This was. And my own sense, I must say from the beginning, and it hasn't happened, that the only real approach, well, let me first say, Dilma has been not a very strong leader. She may be a strong person, she may have strong ideas, but she hasn't really been very effective or impressive as a leader, politically, communication, what have you. And at this point, the only sense, and I think this was mentioned, I forget, I think maybe by Teresa, about the need for some kind of consensus, or at least convergence among the political parties in Brazil to begin, and to call on them to focus on the economic issues first and foremost. They're overwhelmed by the Dilma impeachment. It's taken up so much energy and time. I personally don't think it's a very good solution because after it's done, all the problems remain until the politicians can begin to get together and sort of move forward an agenda, an economic agenda that makes sense. And it's not so hard. There's three political parties that are really at the core of Brazil's politics. Two of them have shared the presidency since 1995. That's the Democratic Socialist Party of Fernando Henrique Cardoso and the Workers' Party of Lula and Dilma. And the third party is the largest party, or close to it, goes back and forth a little bit. The PMDB, what is that? The Brazilian Democratic Movement. I was thinking the Medio Democrático. But anyway, and that's the party that has the head of the Senate, the head of the House, the vice president. It's been part of every government since been an allied part of the government since Brazil returned to democracy. It shouldn't be so hard to find this consensus. In fact, on the economic front, when Dilma chose Joaquim Levy, my sense was there was great wide approval of this everywhere, at least within the business community, within the opposition, within the PT party, her own party. There was some opposition because he was seen as something of a liberal or a neoliberal, and they were worried about cuts. But by and large, outside of her own party, which is one of many, there was a broad sense that this was the guy that could sort of take Brazil and move it forward. Then you have the PMDB, the Democratic Party of Fernando Henrique. Well, that's a party that campaigned on basically the kind of structural policy changes that sort of people are calling for now, that need to be done now. That was the campaign platform of Aécio Neves, and all of a sudden that party has decided that impeachment is really the only solution, and sort of forgotten, and is now voting against the platform that it once supported. But that's their platform. It should not be hard to get them to agree on what they once ran for the presidency. And the third party, that's a rather difficult one, but it's interesting that the vice president is from the party, the Movement Democratic, the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, and has supported Dilma throughout. And in fact, the Senate leader, also of the PMDB, has presented a program that's very similar to what Levy was arguing for. So all I'm saying is it's not now. The head of the House, of course, of that same party, has been the leader of the pro-impeachment forces. So these are three parties that have to find a way. They have a core, are supportive of a serious, deep, profound economic reform, seems to me, but it's not going to happen unless the three of them find some basis for consensus. And I must say that I've not seen any movement to that at all. I've seen no leadership that leads to that. That's what leaves me most worried about Brazil, that these three parties are all sort of fighting over ambition, trying to stay out of jail, looking at the next presidential election, and they're not sort of focusing on what is the central issue now, I think, is the economic, getting the economy back on track. And I'm surprised, frankly, and unhappy that leaders like Lula and Fernando Henrique Cardoso haven't really even tried to move this forward.
Thank you very much, Peter. And well, let's bring the discussion. Well, Peter basically brought us back.
That's what Washington thinks.
Yeah. Actually, I talked to and what Washington thinks is actually that I heard this from, no, the United States government has relations with states, and we will continue to work with President Dilma Rousseff or whoever is managing Brazil, governing Brazil. And actually the relation improved somewhat because of the visit, at least the environment of the relationship improved after the visit the President made here in late June, early July. And, but again, you know, many initiatives that were talked about, cannot be worked on because the internal environment in Brazil does not allow for much to be worked in areas of like defense, for instance. Although there is, and I just heard there will be in the first half of this year, renewed the dialogue, the diplomatic dialogue between Brazil and the United States. Not yet decided whether Secretary Kerry will go to Brazil. That's what should happen. Or if they will, if the Foreign Minister, Mauro Vieira, will come here. With that, I would like to bring the discussion back to on the political side, on the economic side. I don't know, would you go first? Sure. Yes, so Monica de Boll will help us understand what is the possible developments on the economic front in Brazil. I know that Monica is a dear friend. We talked a lot, and she is less optimistic than obviously some others at the table about what's going on. Monica, the floor is yours.
Others.
Thank you. Others, yes.
Others.
It's an institution.
I have 3 points to make, but before I make those 3 points, I want to go back to Mauricio's very, very interesting poll, and specifically to the 80% that think that Dilma will actually make their lives worse in 2016 compared to 2015, and the 65% that think that despite that, their lives will improve in 2016. Yesterday at the Peterson Institute, we had the launch of Steve Weisman's book, The Great Trade-Off, a very, very interesting book on morals and markets. I highly recommend it. And in reading it, I found a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is this, and it's a famous quote, so I'm sure most of you will be familiar with it. But it says the following: "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time, and still retain the ability to function. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless, and yet be determined to make them otherwise." So what I get from this basically is that from Mauricio's poll, either Brazilians have a first-rate intelligence, or it's really no wonder that magical realism is so influential in Latin American literature. Of course, Ted, who's sitting here in the audience, has a different interpretation, but I won't tell you what his interpretation of the fact is. With this in mind, the 3 points I want to focus on are: first, inflation; second, public banks; and third, related to these 2 points, the strategy to revive the economy as I see it, and which does make me rather pessimistic compared to some of the things that were said here earlier. On inflation, we just had the result for 2015. So inflation in 2015 came out at around 10.7%. This is despite a very, very deep recession. This is the worst inflationary result since 2002. That was the year, most of you remember, that was the year of the presidential elections and the fears that President Lula would significantly change the macroeconomic framework. We had inflation of 12% that year. We did not, however, have a recession that year, and that's I think an important comparison to make. What I make of our inflationary situation, of Brazil's inflationary situation at this point in time, when you look at what underlies it, Essentially, what we do see is, of course, there's the influence and the impact of the price readjustments that took place in 2015. But there has been an underlying trend over the last 6 months or so that's been highly worrying. And that trend has to do with a wide dissemination of inflation. So you can see it in the various diffusion indices that the central bank publishes. So inflation is becoming more widely disseminated in the economy. And secondly, what's happening to underlying inflation. So when you look at measures of core inflation in Brazil, these measures have either been stable at very high levels or they're going up. And what this tells you basically is that, you know, the usual link between inflation and economic activity is not working in Brazil at the moment in the way that one would expect. We would have expected, given that we have this type of recessionary scenario in Brazil and the continuation of that scenario going forward, we would have expected inflation by now to have been responding to the slowing activity, and that's not happening. And my own interpretation for why that's not happening is that on the one hand, inflation has a very, very strong fiscal component in Brazil at this point. The inflation is symptomatic of the level of economic disarray that is underlying the country at this point in time. So yes, there were a number of things that were done in 2015. However, significant imbalances remain, and these imbalances, fiscal in nature, are at the core of what's happening to inflation and what's happening to inflation dynamics, and that's very worrying. The second thing is indexation. The Brazilian economy, which is very, very, very used to working under high inflationary scenarios, as you all know, has to a large extent re-indexed itself over the last 18 months or so, even longer actually, because inflation has been above target or close to the top of the target range for quite a number of years. And the level of re-indexation that's happened is frightening because it does break this link between whatever happens to activity and whatever should be happening to the price level. So my own fear is that we will not see the kind of inflation retraction that we would expect throughout 2016. And basically this I think is of great, great concern. This relates to the strategies that I think will be put in place to try to revive the economy. On the political side, which I think João is going to delve into much more than I will, I'm not going to talk about the politics at all. I just want to say that in the last 3 weeks of 2015, we did see significant changes in the political environment in Brazil, changes that actually gave President Dilma Rousseff a window of opportunity to revive the economy in the first 6 months of 2016. And this is of paramount importance because also 2016 is a year of municipal elections in Brazil. The PT is, of course, afraid of losing some of its strongholds in some important municipalities. And hence, there is the need for various reasons, including political survival, to actually try to revive the economy in whatever way is possible. Now, there are 2 ways that this could be done. One has been discarded, which is, let's expand fiscal policy and just let things go and try to revive the economy that way. I think that one is off the cards, and with that, I'm in broad agreement with what was said here previously. But there's another instrument that the government can use. It has used it extensively in the past, and it can resort to it again. And I think the signals that we have seen is that it will. And those are the public banks. Brazil has been using, over the last several years, public banks, specifically BNDES, but not just BNDES, Caixa Econômica Federal, the mortgage bank, and Banco do Brasil, to reignite the economy whenever the economy needed that kind of push. And I think that what we're seeing now is another go at this kind of strategy. And this is something that I think should be highly concerning to everybody, because the level of interference that public banks and the level of segmentation that public banks have created in the Brazilian credit markets has really generated some very, very grave distortions. So when one thinks about going forward, the kind of adjustment that the Brazilian economy needs, everybody's always very, very focused on fiscal adjustment as the main thing. And of course, fiscal adjustment is extremely important. But the other leg of this that can't be ignored, but often is the necessity to reform the financial market in Brazil. You just cannot have a properly functioning financial market where over half of it is credit supplied by public banks, a large amount of which is subsidized and hence is unresponsive to monetary policy. So that brings me back to inflation. If you have inflation at the level that it's at, with a strategy to revive the economy that will involve public credit, and most likely public credit at subsidized rates, you're basically making a bad situation worse. And this is where I fear we're possibly going. To conclude, as I was saying before, I'm more on the pessimistic side. I think we are going in the direction of redoing some policies, not the whole work, the whole work, but some policies that were done under the first Dilma administration, and that will not bode well for Brazil in 2016. I'll finish off by saying that the minimum wage was increased this year by more than the actual minimum wage indexing rule would have suggested, which means that, not only will we have that kind of inflationary pressure also in the economy, but it will also be a high fiscal burden for Brazil, given that many benefits and other expenditures are indexed to the minimum wage. So I'll finish on that note and leave it to João to give us the
hope.
The hope.
João, it's going to be up to you. I'd like to ask you two things, actually. When are we going to see Eduardo Cunha leaving the premises? Because there is the hope that the crisis is an opportunity to reintroduce a level of decency in Brazilian politics, and this would be obviously a clear indication of that. And there is obviously an ongoing process in the Congress. And the other one is one point that Monica touched upon, and I know that Mauricio has some information about municipal elections. How will they affect the scenario? It's municipal elections in Brazil happen 2 years before general elections. It's sort of an organizing factor of the system. And if Mauricio is right in some of the things he told me, you could have very meaningful outcomes here affecting the relative power of political parties. So, João.
Well, thank you, Paulo, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and Happy New Year to everyone. I'm sorry to, disappoint, as it won't be that optimistic, I think. I would start by saying that, as I think it's been said before, that I don't think that what's going on in Brazil right now, it constitutes an institutional crisis. It is a deep political crisis, of course. It is a deep economic crisis. But it is the fact that institutions work that we're having this. The fact that you have independent institutions, especially the judiciary and the public prosecutors that are carrying on with investigations. If you look at, take a look at the map and see other emerging markets, and especially in Latin America, where you have very serious corruption scandals, but that, it's not leading to this. And something that's happening after the post-commodity boom environment, and a lot where these political systems, Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, et cetera, were flooded with money for 10 years or so. Now that the tide has receded, I think that the conflicts now for that remainder of resources is beginning to generate these problems. But I do think that this is a deep, of course, political and economic crisis that will get worse this year, right? We haven't seen the bottom of it yet. And the economy, I think it has been mentioned here, you do have not only a recessionary mode that's going to reflect more and more on labor market, possibly with unemployment reaching double digits, and other repercussions that will have on the politics, protests, strikes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on the politics, of course, the politics of the impeachment, which was going to be the topic that I'll focus here. And we have, basically at Eurasia Group, we have 3 scenarios that we are working with here. One in which, the first one, the base case in which Dilma Rousseff survives. We think that despite the deepening of the crisis this year, that she survives, and that's our base case scenario. The second one is that there's an impeachment, she falls, and Temer takes over. The third one, I'll talk about it at the end, just to leave the suspense. So the first one, Rousseff survives. We give that a 60% odds. We've had those odds for quite some time now, basically saying that it is, of course, a very weak call. Basically by saying that we do have to take a step back, and as analysts we have to be humble enough to acknowledge that there's some factors that are not political, right? In the case, the fact that you have investigations ongoing, there's a great legal dimension to it. We compare what's happening in Brazil right now, what happened in Italy in the early 1990s with the Operation Clean Hands, and whether or not this is a deeper process that's happening in Brazil. But why do we think Rousseff will survive the impeachment process? I mean, the short answer is that the bar to impeach is much higher than the bar not to be impeached, right? Meaning that if you look at the numbers in Congress, the opposition needs 2/3 of votes in the lower house to pass the motion for impeachment, while the government needs 1/3 plus 1 votes of lawmakers not completely anti-impeachment, either anti-impeachment or just abstention. So, in fact, if you use the last vote for the special committee on impeachment that happened last month as a proxy, the government needs roughly 172 votes to block an impeachment motion, and they had 199 against plus 40 or so abstentions. So in fact there's 70 votes above the threshold, the minimum threshold needed. Of course. And that's a very strong, I think, statement to be made. It doesn't show a strong government, of course, but it does show that the bar to block an impeachment is lower. But again, as I said early, that the crisis will deepen, then there's a question of timing here. For the government, the sooner the better. If the impeachment vote goes to the impeachment motion goes to a vote in the lower house by March or April at the latest, we still think that the numbers in Congress, the balance of power in Congress still benefits the government. But if it becomes a protracted kind of process, which is possible, of course, given the magical realism that influences Brazilian politics as well and legislation, that it becomes a greater risk because of this unfavorable dynamics coming from the economy. Rousseff will become more vulnerable, and then the mobilization towards a more pro-impeachment forces may become a reality. Nevertheless, when you look at what a Rousseff government looks like, despite the likelihood that she will survive the impeachment motion, she won't be out of the woods just yet. She will remain a weak president. There are other impeachment motions pending as well that could, and the Lava Jato will continue. Which is always going to be kind of that sensation of when the other shoe will drop. I think that sensation will remain this year for quite some time, and will be a president that will survive, but with some scars. Basically, she'll resort to the left as she has resorted now to her traditional base of support, labor unions, etc., to survive. And I think that will reflect to some extent the post-impeachment policy outcome. I agree kind of in the middle ground between Monica and Teresa. Teresa's second scenario of muddling through, where we've seen kind of some initiatives, even from Nelson Barbosa now, basically, at least on the fiscal front, very similar to Levy. On the para-fiscal front, not so much. But with some glimpses of hope, CPMF likely to pass. I think that pension reform, we think that the government will try to maintain the ambiguity, and they're going to revive the Council of Social and Economic Development to kind of add an extra step before having to commit to specifics, kind of signaling to the markets with one hand while waving a rock with the other, basically, and to the left-wing movements. So basically not a very promising outlook there, of course. I think from market's perspective, if she survives, it's going to tank from there. So that's kind of the base case, our base case scenario in case of Rousseff survives, which I can talk about more at Q&A. The second one, of course, is the impeachment scenario, where this dynamics it ends up favoring a pro-impeachment movement in Congress, and then Vice President Michel Temer takes over. Obviously, that scenario brings some upsides in the very near term. The change in the turnover in people. The document that the PMDB published last year is very it's music to the ears of many investors and Brazil watchers of what needs to be done to kind of fix the economy, etc. And we do think that there's some low-hanging fruits that he would be able to kind of pick on pre-SALT legislation and some specifics. But then, but it would be a brief honeymoon. We think that at the end of the day, the outlook of a Temer administration would be much worse than many people are interpreting. I think part of it has to do with what Peter said as well, the lack of new ideas, the lack of leadership. Paulo mentioned as well that's not only lack of leadership in the government, but also in the opposition. And the fact that, Temer is not that, his popularity levels are not that higher than Dilma. His own party can be considered a co-conspirator to the major corruption scandal in Brazil's history. His party is divided. The PSDB will have incentives to give just soft support to a PMDB government, meaning all the problems that will face. A Temer government would face a radical, very vocal opposition, the PT, in Congress and in the streets. This is a recipe of not very smooth sailing. And the economy will continue to be very challenging, where the recipe to fix the economy will continue to be unpopular. Keep in mind that if you compare this moment with the 1990s, where you have the reforms, influenced by the so-called Washington Consensus, that back then those reforms were very hard to be implemented, but were implemented after the so-called lost decade of the 1980s, where people were completely, I think, coming out of this very unfavorable moment. The moment now is the opposite. People are coming out of 10 years of abundance. So the levels of tolerance in the streets for any kind of unpopular measures are very small, and that regardless of who's sitting in the presidential palace. So bottom line is that the main difference between a Temer government and a Dilma government would be the very near term, where there will be some kind of a glimpse of hope and short-lived in terms of policies. So the next year or two not being very promising. Finally, just to touch upon the third scenario that I mentioned, it's basically one that's kind of creeping up, which is the election being validated by the Electoral Superior Court of Brazil. And and when we say 60% odds of Rousseff finishing her term, 40% odds of her not finishing her term. Within those 40%, I would say that we include impeachment, and almost equally now the odds of the invalidation of the election, which would be the closest thing that we would have to a solution to the crisis from a credibility and legitimacy point of view, because then you wipe the slate clean. And the messier the process gets from a political point of view, the higher the odds of an anti-establishment candidate being elected and not the PSDB, which would be the front runner probably. And by anti-establishment, take that with a grain of salt in Brazil, which would mean probably Marina Silva. And let me finish here.
Well, but back to my question. Eduardo Cunha is the third in the line of succession in Brazil. Tell me, when?
Yeah, well, this third scenario, with the timing of it, there are two reasons that we think that it won't happen now. The first one being that before the Congress makes a decision on impeachment, we highly doubted that they will make a decision on this, not to burst the Congress's bubble in dealing with the impeachment process. And secondly, Eduardo Cunha as well. Cunha will fall, that without a doubt. But the problem is who comes in his place, right? And in Brazil, you know,
I have a suggestion.
In Brazil, the problem with Brazil is that the lack of leadership, of renewal leadership, and the fact that in Brazilian politics there's no capital punishment. Mm-hmm. People come from the dead all the time. If you look at Renan Calheiros, Fernando Collor, there's no capital punishment, and that's a key problem in the fact that there's no leadership. Even in the opposition, you look at the names in the opposition that are being tried to be sold as new. They've been around for 30 years, right? And I think we don't have in Brazil what we've had in Greece and Spain with these new movements. Not saying that these are in nature good, but by definition, but still, it's something that we don't have new ideas to face these new problems that the country's facing.
I know one guy that has been around for 45 years. I remember when I was a reporter in Recife, and he was a state assembly person. Now federal congressman, former senator. Jarbas Vasconcelos is my candidate to the presidency, the speakership of the House, one of the most honorable, decent Brazilian politicians. Any chance of that happening?
I think there's a chance that an independent name, or considered independent name, takes over, but it's going to be a messy process regardless, I think, and the PMDB is a very divided party, and there's a clear lack of leadership.
Okay, talking about messy stuff, Mauricio, you mentioned to me, I hope that I understood it right on the phone, what's going to happen with the candidates from the PT to in the mayoral elections? You gave me some pretty interesting
From my perspective and the numbers that we do have at the moment, I think PT is gonna have a very hard time in municipal elections, especially in the big cities and what they call medium to big cities. And they are now internally at PT. For example, I'm going to give an example. São Paulo is very likely that PT is going to lose São Paulo, as an example. And the discussions that they are having right now is that they are like expecting a very big loss this year. So they are discussing internally in the party two options. One is to start to support other parties and to play like the secondary role. As an example, Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil was always a place that PT had their own candidates. Actually, they elected the mayor of Porto Alegre before Lula or any big movements. So they are now considering heavily to support the Communist Party there and in other cities as well. And there's another part of PT that wants to have their own candidates everywhere just to establish position and start to building a more leftist PT for the future. My guess, based on the polls that we have, is that we're going to have a bigger PMDB in terms of numbers of cities in Brazil. PMDB today, if I'm not wrong, has about 1,100 mayors in Brazil. So we're talking about going to 12 to 1,300 PMDB. We're going to have a bigger Eduardo Campos former party, PSP. I think they're going to grow as a party in terms of mayors. And one thing that is also, PSTB is growing in the north and the northeast. That happened in the last election, but I do think that they have a lot of shots on those, especially medium cities that PSTB was not that well. So for the PT, they're going to have to think through this election because it's going to be very tough. I run polls everywhere, and everybody, not only because of the scandal itself, but because of the economy and to relate the economy to the PT, to Dilma. So that is Dilma, what happened to Dilma that she forgot her own base of voters. Dilma's voters are angry with the policies, are angry with the economy, and that is going to be very hard to capture on the municipal election.
Now, we are going now to ask for your participation. Do you have questions? You can direct it to one specific person, to the whole panel. Obviously, you also are free to make observations. It's cold in here. It has been a problem at the Wilson Center for the years I have been here. Yes. What's her name? Meg.
I'm Meg Lunsager, a public policy fellow here, but I was at the IMF previously representing the United States. And I had one question before we started in mind in terms of how likely is it that the policy, the whole situation gets so bad that they actually reform the whole fiscal structure in terms of how spending is determined, eliminate earmarks, that sort of thing. But I think I have my answer from all of you that that's highly unlikely. So my question is really something broader and international. How likely do you think it is that Brazil might turn to its BRICS friends, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, for some solidarity, from some signals of support? I mean, we have the new Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, we have the BRICS Bank, we have these institutions that could do something pretty quickly. There's also the swap lines, that the BRICS have agreed to. Do you think there's any chance that Brazil might want to draw on that just to show it as a symbol of solidarity? Of course, reserves are very high now, but they're not going to want to run them down big time. So just how likely would it be? And is there any way of getting like some big investment project going that could be a positive signal for the real economy?
Yeah, especially in infrastructure and things like that. Who would like to try an answer to Peter?
Two things. First of all, the BRIC countries are having deep financial, economic problems. So they're not going to be particularly generous for a while, at least. Secondly is, if you look at the BRIC group, it's really China, with everybody else being the spokes. I mean, that's the hub. And the actual relationships between the other BRIC countries are very, very modest. So the question is really, will China be able to do very much for Brazil? And, you know, I don't know how the Chinese are thinking about Brazil right now. They've been very instrumental in looking to Brazil for its commodities and providing investments that would facilitate extracting the exporting of those commodities. But it's really China is the country that is central to this. The others are really not going to be very helpful in any possible way.
Yes, Ottaviano, no? Ambassador Einaudi.
Nobody's mentioned the Olympics.
Why did you have to raise that?
No, because I remember Mexico. And Tlatelolco was, in a sense, the signal of the ultimate decay of the PRI system. What are we facing in Brazil? Will it have any impact? Brazil is famous for political nonviolence, in spite of certain very narrow periods or moments. Is there any chance that the buildup of dissatisfaction will help create a moment where the Olympics will have exactly the opposite effect of what was planned in asking for it?
Let me, well, go ahead.
Yeah, it's simple.
To say about that.
Economically speaking, the Olympics is nothing. It doesn't mean, but there is the possibility that may politically uplift the name of the mayor of Rio de Janeiro if everything goes well. That's the only outcome that
Yeah, let me just mention.
I fully agree. And being from Rio, yes, that's definitely what the likely legacy of the Olympics will be. You know, it will definitely uplift the mayor. That's it. That's why I think none of us mentioned the Olympics as a meaningful event in any direction, be it politics, be it economics.
But how about never underestimate Brazil's capacity to throw a party? Is that going to help? João, please. Is that
No, I agree. And also being from Rio, I think there's it's been actually a burden to move around Rio during the preparations for the Olympics. But I fully agree that on the economic point of view, it's not even a blip. But politically, I think that Eduardo Paes, it is one of the rising new leaders of Brazil, and for him, it does make sense to try to. I mean, given the opportunity that 2018 is going to be open field politics in Brazil. I think we've maybe reached a point where the so-called new republic of '85 came to a close right now, with all the major political parties having governed the country, and now we're kind of what next, right? And I think Eduardo Paes could be a name, and for him, because usually when you're mayor, you can climb the ladder, and the traditional next step would be governor. But given the fact that the fiscal dynamics of states in Brazil, especially Rio, because of the oil, is going to be horrible the next 5 years, governorship before used to accrue more power and then prepare for presidency. Now governorships, at least next cycle, will consume political capital, and for him, either presidency or Senate.
Luigi, let me say one thing. Remind an interview that former Brazilian ambassador Rubens Recupero gave to Valor Econômico, here represented by its new correspondent in Washington, dear friend, Giuliano Basile, Recuperos described this as the final agony, the crisis of a system, which is the system of what I mentioned, the state capitalism that is collapsing, and that will need a new political arrangement to support whatever comes after this. This will be a 5-10 year process. But this is the hopeful side. Let me give one positive and one negative. The positive is that we are doing this in democracy. As João said, you know, the institutions are there and we are making them work. A worrisome component to me, and I wrote about a piece about this that appeared in Estado today on page 2, it's the rise of intolerance in Brazil. The intolerance, political intolerance. I used 2 episodes that happened around Christmas, one involving Chico Buarque de Holanda, the other involving Joaquim Barbosa, that I think are 2 national treasures of Brazil. And they are in opposite sides, and they were both insulted in the streets of Rio because of the positions that they have, the roles that they play. And I wrote a piece that I think we'll have copies there. It appeared in today's Estado about the poison of intolerance, because all of a sudden you see people in Brazil having a type of political dialogue that I think Americans are used to, given the polarization, right, in the political campaign, which was not there in Brazil until last 2014 election, when things really became very bad. But it is a problem, and and I end this article by mentioning Simon Schwartzman, who is the first Brazilian scholar of the Wilson Center, wrote a piece, also note to friends, saying that, you know, the challenge in Brazil is really to build a modern pluralistic society where people from different sides can engage and can criticize, but as adversaries, not as enemies. And this is obviously an issue that we face in the United States. This is an issue in Brazil, and if you have time and patience, the article is available, and it's free access. Now, more questions, please. Margaret, and then.
Thank you very much. I've kind of 2 but related questions. And on the political side, nobody has commented really on maybe the fragility, the chaos of the political system, because the electoral law allows for so many different parties without peso, without weight in the Congress and so forth. Among the new ideas that are being discussed, is there any discussion about changing the electoral law in order to strengthen really the balance, the divisions, and form stronger coalitions that don't have so much regional linkage? And a second question is on confronting, what new ideas are being discussed that look toward how do we fix this system. It seems to me during the commodity crisis, the country kind of got drunk on export revenues and failed to look at and invest in the kind of infrastructure, the kind of education, other issues that would allow Brazil to be competitive in a non-commodity driven future. What is the private sector saying? What is the government doing in these areas?
I would like to say about changing the electoral laws in order to stimulate a more representative system.
Yeah, I mean, political reform is the never-ending story in Brazil, right? I mean, there are many, as a political scientist, you know, I've done a lot of studying about that. And there's no ideal model, right? And to be honest, I don't think that the number of parties is the main problem. I mean, if you look at the coalitions, how the coalition is the main political agent, not the party, and how the coalitions behave, they're quite stable. And Brazil's so-called coalitional presidentialism is very stable. But in moment of deep crisis, as we're seeing now, it is a problem, and it requires a lot of presidential power and leadership, which we lack right now. So I think that there could be solutions or suggestions, at least, to give more of a parliamentary system, or at least give more power to parts of Congress. But I don't think that just you know, that's going to be a silver bullet to kind of solve all these issues. Now, there are proposals to create districts, which would make the deputies who are elected to the lower house, in theory, closer, but that's also skewed because then you reduce the representation of minorities because not necessarily live in the same place. So there's a mixed system like in Germany, blah, blah, blah. So there are many recipes. I don't think that's the main problem now in Brazil, but
João, given the lack of leadership and the fact that the presidency will remain very weak and the problems are urgent, any chance that we stumble into a parliamentary system?
No, I think now would be dangerous, right, to do this in a moment of crisis. I mean, always the idea of, oh, let's change the system when things are doing badly, right? I think that maybe the idea, and it could be revived. Would be the third time that Brazil attempts this. They did in '63, '93, people rejected it. But I think it's a discussion for the next government right now.
Peter.
Well, just one answer is that I'm always suspicious about and don't have much confidence when people advocate changing the rules of politics in most places, because the problems are always deeper than the rules themselves, that people sort of manage to adjust the rules. And I think of all the reforms that happened in the United States in the 60s and 70s to change the way the primaries worked, to change the way outsiders could finance elections and all. And they've led to sort of the kind of political outcome, perhaps, that we have today, or there's some other thing. But the rules are not going to solve the problem. I mean, there's no way that there is sort of a simple one or two rules that you sort of manage that somehow all of a sudden Brazil is going to flourish into, you know, Athens in its golden age.
Okay. Do you have?
I have one practical issue. There is to be elected in Brazil in any democracy costs a lot of money, and they changed the rule in a way that in 2016 only private companies will not be able legally to donate to campaigns. So, and almost all the donors are in jail as well. So there's gonna be harder. So who's gonna?
That's a solution.
There you go. They can build more jails.
So they're gonna start. I'm feeling this because they start realizing that now they're gonna ask to donations for private citizens. And to do that, imagine a private Brazilian to donate to a Brazilian politician right now. It's completely unlikely. So I think one of the things that if they're going to go to this road of private personal donations, they're going to have to go to the district elections. Because people don't donate if they feel that the solution or the politician are very distant from them. This election is going to be crucial because no campaign is going to have official money. That's clear for me. So
well, that's out in the open, right?
Yeah, but anyway, if they're going to go that road to personal donations, they're going to have to do district voting system because people are only going to relate to very close to their money. And but on the other hand, this system about personal donations, it's going to be very tough to get new politicians because people, old names, known names, people that have been around for a long time, it's going to be much easier to be known because to be a politician, to be known, you have to spend money. If the budgets of the campaigns are going to be much reduced, only the old names are going to be on the spot. So it's going to be a very interesting to see how that's going to play.
Steve Schwartzman, Environmental Defense Fund.
Thank you, Paulo. And thanks to all the panelists for a really interesting discussion. My question is for Mauricio and João, but also other members of the panel if they have thoughts. Do you see any signs that Marina's party, a rede, could be a factor at all in the municipal elections, possibly in Brasilia or maybe elsewhere?
Just me compliment on that. Is Rede attracting politicians from the PT that are on the ethical department of the PT and think that they should move on?
I mean, well, Mauricio can talk about, I mean, I don't know if he has done numbers on this, but no, Rede, I mean, as the name of the party is net, it's getting people from all over the place. It's just kind of, they threw the white net, not to make the joke out of it, but I do think that it's the only thing that apparently that we have in Brazil right now is it could become a new movement. It's not there yet. I think to call Marina anti-establishment would be a stretch. I mean, this is a person who created the PT and has been a senator, a minister, but her party, it's a glimpse, I think, it may be an incipient movement of something new, like we had maybe in Spain with the Ciudadanos and Podemos, or in Greece, but so far, I think that it's going to be, I think the municipal elections will be an interesting test, not only with respect to the campaign financing and the cost of, but also to see glimpses of a new message that so far the mainstream parties, the PMDB, the PSDB, the PT, haven't yet updated their software, I think, to not only now, but since 2013 with the protests.
Is it true that Marina is the only nationally known politician whose preference is going up in polls?
I have a personal experience with Marina's way of doing politics, and unless she changes a lot, she'll never win a presidential election. She had all the tools to win the presidential election last year. She was she had everything what happened with Eduardo Campos. She had the narrative because people were tired of PSDB and PT last year. But the way that she ran the campaign in a very amateur way gives a huge sign how they operate and how the NET operate. NET took like 4 years to establish as a party. One thing that's very easy to do in Brazil is to establish a party. They took 4 years to do it. So they run the things in a very unprofessional way. Unless they change it a lot and they start running as to win elections, it's going to be much more. And I have something that I always tell my clients. The meat of Marina is much better than the candidate of Marina. So candidates, and we go to ask for votes, and we have to do it in a way to have grassroots, to have a message, to have a slogan, to have a strategy. And she lost for the PT because they didn't have a strategy to answer the Dilma's attacks. They didn't have at all. And they have, because one thing that Marina was the Lula's version, the female Lula version. She had to win the election last year. So Marina as a president, unless she changes a lot, and she decided, once I had the opportunity to show a pool to Marina, and she thinks she wants to send the message in her own way, and that's it. And that doesn't work. I don't think that that PT, PSDB, and PMDB didn't change the software. They're very aware about the changes in the politics, but PT, PSDB, and PMDB have a lot of parties inside the party. So there is there's a lot of PTs inside PT, there's a lot of PMDBs inside, and so it's very tough to handle the internal politics as well. But we have good candidates for all those parties, and we have bad candidates from all those parties.
I would add another piece of advice of my own to Marina. Never, ever again let academic economists to write their economic program.
This is well, let's leave at that, because we are going to start a discussion here. That's not.
But in all of this excellent discussion, we've been looking for something positive. And one thing stands out as being significantly positive, and that's the level of international reserves. So the question is, and the one thing which will trigger a shift from muddle to crisis is that Brazil runs out of international reserves. So my question to Monica and to Teresa is, what is your forecast for that? Or maybe they won't, because the economy will continue contracting so much that imports will decline and they won't run out of reserves.
Paulo, but yes. I still want to address the issue.
Okay.
The second question that Margaret made it. That it was,
hold everything, go.
Yes, because I believe it's a quite important one. It's undeniable that the boom period with the commodity price ended up bringing some negative side, Dutch disease kind of problems. Even resource curse, resource curse because the dreams derived from the pre-salt oil discovery ended up, happening. But having said that, there have been some progress in some structural factors in Brazil that may not necessarily have been given the due notes. I'll give one. The better figures in terms of income distribution and poverty reduction, only very partially, and Mauricio here knows this quite well, can be accounted for by social policies or things like conditional cash transfer. A substantial chunk of the improvement in terms of poverty level has come from simply improving access to education, according to the estimates, the breakdown made by the World Bank on this. Far from getting to quality, to good quality. One can imagine with the jump that it might happen if we had improved in terms of quality. But the fact is, some of the structural improvement at the bottom of the pyramid in Brazil are due to things that even precede the PT, but which have been fortunately maintained. On infrastructure, in 2013, Dilma herself realized that the approach she had implemented in previous years had failed, particularly because there were new besides the Chinese, in the case of the auction of oil, nobody else was coming into the place. And then already in 2013, she departed from these tight caps on returns that her Treasury Secretary was, but then it was too late. But she managed to have at least 2 successful auctions regarding airports. And then she suspended this approach in 2014. And then they were retaken last year, 2015, to the point that Joaquin could brag at a certain moment that finally a successful auction had been done. And guess what? And the investors had brought their money.
The Chinese. The Chinese in this sense.
But it's still, there is a change of approach in terms of a partnership between the public and private sectors that is clearly improvement now vis-a-vis what had prevailed in the past. So, and there is a strong silver lining that one should, I strongly believe that after we go through this rubber baron crisis, remember the rubber barons? Brazil is not the first to undergo this kind of crisis of the crony capitalism, right? So it's not the end of the world. We have seen things like those in this country and as well as in France, as described by Karl Marx.
But
go down on
duly noted, but it's hurting right now.
The pain is now.
Yeah. Monica and Teresa on reserves. Please.
Okay, let me before I get to reserves, let me just say something on what Taviano was saying regarding the extent of poverty alleviation. I won't touch on poverty alleviation because I think that's a very good story that Brazil has to tell over the last decade. But where I do take issue is the reduction of inequality story. The reduction of inequality story, to me, has one big element which has to do with the minimum wage. And when we look at the data, the household survey data that people normally look at to draw, conclusions about the reduction of inequality, we know that the PNAD, the so-called PNAD, the household survey in Brazil, is highly influenced by the minimum wage. So, the fact that we've had a very, very generous nominal wage indexing rule in place since 2006, of course, explains a lot of the so-called reduction in inequality. The second issue I have with that has to do with the fact that whenever you do look at inequality in Brazil, you are looking at inequality before taxes and before transfers. When you look at inequality after taxes and after transfers, the story is not as rosy as it seems. So that's the second point I wanted to make. Reserves. On reserves, I do not have a very optimistic view on reserves, lest I be inconsistent with what I was saying before. Yes, the central bank tells us that we have 370 billion in reserves at the moment. However, the central bank has been heavily engaged in these swap operations since 2013. In 2013, these swap operations were essentially motivated by the so-called taper tantrum, so the tapering off of QE in the U.S. And at that point, the kind of turbulence that created in Brazil and in other emerging markets was the key motivation for the swaps that the central bank started doing. But the fact is that the taper tantrums has been over for quite some time now, and the central bank has continued to intervene in foreign exchange markets in the same manner. In fact, as Teresa mentioned in her presentation, as of 2015, the central bank made a loss of 90 billion reais, or 1.5% of GDP, on these operations alone. And so that tells you something about the impact that foreign currency intervention is having in Brazil. It also tells you something about reserves, because to do these operations, these are swaps, so they're derivatives. So the way that you measure the stock is somewhat difficult to do, but the sense we have is that the notional value of this stock today is of about $120 billion. Now, because these swap operations are settled in reais, and I'm not going to go into the technicality of how this is done, but because it's settled in reais, you don't see that in reserves. So you can say you have three reserves of 370 billion, but at the same time, you have a notional stock of 120 billion and I interpret that as a capital outflow that has not happened. So if you were to subtract the 120 from the 370, which I think is a more conservative in a good way of viewing reserves, it's actually 250. And the way that the economy is being handled at the moment does not suggest to me that reserves are going to be rising, much to the contrary, despite what's happening on the trade front and on the trade balance.
Okay, before giving the floor to Ottaviano, because he wants to speak, Teresa, do we have 370 or 250?
Well, in general, I agree with Monica, but on this I don't. I basically think that, I could see the swap operation also as a way of, let's say, avoiding a greater depreciation of the exchange rate. So, I mean, they could have allowed the exchange rate to go down more, and they still would have the reserves, and they wouldn't have the liabilities that they have. And so, in fact, I think that basically, I don't see very soon a foreign exchange crisis in Brazil. First, because they can let the exchange rate go down more, at a cost in inflation. And I think the inflation is going to be what is actually going to be the mechanism of adjustment in Brazil, personally. I
agree.
If there isn't a change in, a more radical change in economic policy towards, more sustained fiscal and quasi-fiscal adjustment. On that, I totally agree with Monica on the point that, there is likely to be more now quasi-fiscal return to quasi-fiscal operation for the public banks. So I just don't think that that is going to be the big loss of reserves is anywhere in the near future. Partly also because the current account is improving for the reasons that I said. It's basically the reflection of the decline in demand and also somewhat of an improvement in competitiveness. We all know that capital flows can become very big in Brazil, but we are not there, and hopefully will not get there.
Yeah, I'll be very brief on this. We, Monica and I, we have been in opposite positions for some time. It's undeniable that there is the third scenario laid out by Teresa. It's a possibility. And for that third scenario, the swap program is not key, is not that much relevant. The swap program has been more of a subsidy to the private sector which apparently the Brazilian corporate sector has taken the opportunity to reduce its indebtedness. If you look at the figures of issuance last year, we'll see simply the private sector is taking, so this has become more of a fiscal issue. That's undeniable, but not an issue of balance of payments. As long as the government does not provide any desperate fiscal things, as described in Teresa's third scenario, I don't believe it is likely to watch a capital outflow enough to generate a balance of payment crisis. And that's why the IMF possibility beyond technical dialogue is really not a likely one.
So
Let me
Right,
just,
Alfredo?
let me just,
basic economics. So Monica believes that we're going to have to go to the IMF, given what you said.
no. No. Monica believes that we're in a very difficult position right now. I do not believe that we're heading towards a balance of payments crisis in the typical sense. So this is not how I meant to respond to your question. The way I meant to respond to your question was what Brazil is doing at the moment with the swap operations, and we can call it a fiscal issue, we can call it whatever we want, but it's untransparent. And that's the issue I have with it. I agree with Teresa that, you know, at the end of the day, what the central bank has been trying to do is to prevent a more severe devaluation of the real for various reasons, including because of the impact that it has on inflation. But the fact that it's been doing it via these swap operations is untransparent. It's opaque. And in that sense, it's not good. So that's why I have problems with it. Now, because it's opaque and because it's untransparent and because of the sorts of untransparent and opaque things that other things that the government has been doing in the past, that does hurt confidence. And that at some point could lead to a materialization of Teresa's third scenario, in which case maybe it's the IMF, maybe it's China, if China is willing to lend to Brazil. But it's got to be someone, because at some point, you know, the country runs into serious trouble. That's my only
So that's that scenario that we talked about where, you know, the political crisis stays unresolved for too long, and even domestic investors obviously lose confidence and start capital flight and stuff like that. Well, Gabriele.
Thank you. I'll be quick. It's a follow-up question to the discussion just now on currency volatility. Payout right now is 4-1. How much lower do you think the government's going to let this currency? How much? What is the floor that we can expect, perhaps, in months?
I'll let Ottaviano answer.
Hold the door there.
I knew that.
And second, if you could discuss a little bit what's going on with consumer behavior. You know, I was in Brazil twice in December in 3 different cities, and I was amazed by restaurants are packed, malls are packed, airports are crowded with families traveling. I read a statistic in the Global in December that retail sales year on year from December were only down 1%. Has it not caught up yet? And household burden the debt is just rising. When can we see an impact of the inflation and the currency on consumer behavior? Thank you.
Who wants to try that?
Well, I mean, I don't know, you know, I don't like to look at anecdotal evidence. I mean, it's quite clear that that consumption has been maintained more than, I mean, or has fallen less than investment, and that could be expected. But it is falling in a country that traditionally has not had, you know, big declines in consumption. I mean, I think it's likely to get worse on the consumer side because not only, you know, of the debt burden. I mean, and there is some adjustment to be made of that, but especially because of concerns if the unemployment rate continues to go up, then people will start having a more defensive, an even more defensive behavior. I think consumers are going to have more defensive behavior. But we'll see you know, when the fourth quarter, you know, national accounts come out, whether, you know, there has been any sort of revival, perhaps sort of short-lived and Christmas-induced in consumption.
And restaurants may be packed, but look at the real estate.
Yeah, and the house and cars.
Oh,
And cars, yeah.
I don't know. There's another thing that the unemployment insurance benefit that people that got unemployed in 2015 are going to expire in the first quarter of this year. So that's going to have a huge impact as well.
Well, let's come to this side here. Marcelo, starting with Marcelo, I will collect some of Carol, right here. Marcelo first, and then we have 3 questions here, and then we have
And
Jeff.
Alfredo over there.
João, you talk about 3 scenarios for Dilma's future. No impeachment, and cancel or delete the elections. What this means, or how can be, which reason can produce this third scenario?
Illegal campaign financing.
Does that exist?
Well,
And that would lead to, in 90 days, to new elections.
that would, if there's proof, to give a big background, the Superior Electoral Court early last year approved all the campaign accounts, and now they reopened Rousseff's campaign. So they're investigating. Rumors have it that there's some evidence, potential evidence of illegal campaign financing there. And if it becomes proven, then that the Electoral Court can invalidate the ticket. So then what happens is that both Roussef and Temer fall, essentially. If that happens in the first half of the term, this means that then the president of the lower house, Eduardo Cunha, takes over for 90 days, and he has to call direct elections, and that person who wins that election completes Roussef's term. If it happens in the second half of the term, meaning 2017 or 18, you have Eduardo Cunha again, or whoever is the president of the lower house, assumes for 30 days and calls indirect elections, meaning Congress elects the new government. So in the first scenario, this would be good naturally for the PSDB, since they have Aécio Neves with the recall, et cetera, direct elections. And the second scenario would be in favor better to the PMDB, since they're the largest party in Congress.
João, but can we agree in that scenario that Eduardo Cunha will not be president of Brazil?
Well, as you know,
It's personal. It's personal.
Yeah, no, I think it's, well, but he's,
Okay.
he's like Trump, right? It's a gift that keeps on giving, right?
That's serious. That is
You'll
a
have a
serious
heart attack.
Just a question with respect to the legal judicial system. I would have liked a little bit more precision of what is the minimum time we can think they decide such important things as the validation of the elections, or what's the maximum time there? So because unless those things are decided, I think Brazil is not moving. If everybody is still under investigation, is just, obviously on the political side, on the economic side, you have stifled systems. And I wished we have at least some kind of ideas when these issues can be resolved optimistically or not.
That's probably the easiest.
Well, one of the main problems in Brazil, among many, including the political dysfunctionalities that Margaret made reference to, is that the morose nature of Brazil's judicial system, right? You have cases pending in the Supreme Court that have been there with huge macroeconomic implications that have been there for 20, 30 years, since the big economic plans of the 1980s and 90s. In terms of timing in this specific case, and answering Apollo's question as well, I don't think it will happen before Congress decides the impeachment motion, March, April, and Cunha sitting there. So I would guess, even though it's not a hard deadline, that it will probably happen by the middle of the year, May or June this year.
Yes.
My only source that I have about this is the electoral lawyer of PMDB, and he told me that process can go beyond 5 years if it goes with all the appeals.
Okay.
That's
There is a question. Yes, you have a question there? Yes. And then Jeff.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions. One is, in late December, we saw in the newspapers that Jacques Wagner said that Planalto was going to call for a meeting of this Social and Economic Development Council to discuss policy options and the way forward. Does this mean anything? Is this something that can actually achieve anything at all?
They're just I think they're just creating an additional step before they need to commit to specific policies. That's it.
Okay, and my second question, with regard to the possibility of more quasi-fiscal operations by the public banks. We recently have witnessed the payment of the pedaladas, no? That they settled these arrears to public banks. So the government seems to have taken seriously this big political cost of incurring again in this type of activity. Is the inability to produce a subsidy from the budget for BNDES, for example, for the PSI, something that, or for Minha Casa Minha Vida, something that will put some kind of brake on the process of quasi-fiscal operations, or is again something that can be circumvented by finding new ways to provide this kind of stimulus?
I think they will, the level of creativity that we're dealing with in terms of finding new ways of circumventing and creating pedaladas on top of pedaladas is endless. Yeah. So the way that the pedaladas were actually paid for, the pedaladas were the arrears, the payment, a bunch of payment arrears that had been run in the years before. And that the government decided to clean the slate. This was actually Joaquim Levy who decided to clean the slate, and very, very properly so. At the end of 2015, he didn't get to do it, but then the Minister Nelson Barbosa did, using what is called the Treasury account at the central bank. And as you know, there are some questions regarding the use of the Treasury account at the central bank for paying off pedaladas. It's not clear that the Treasury account at the central bank should be used for that reason. So that could in itself be argued in some way to have been a pedalada. So, there was a pedalada to pay off a pedalada. And now the pedalada that was used to pay off the pedalada has been paid to BNDES. And the government has recently said, and it came out in the papers, that they're going to use this money that was paid to BNDES to, lo and behold, extend more credit. So here we go, a third level of pedalada. So that tells you something about the endless creativity that the government has to manage or find its way around.
And you probably know what the origin of the term pedalada is. Pedalada is a fake movement in soccer. There was a time when we used to play soccer in Brazil well, that we had the bicicleta,
That
which
was also when we had good music.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, that we still do. But the thing, except with the Corinthians, obviously, that is enormously successful.
Ex-Corinthians, because the Chinese bought the
yeah, they bought the Santos, they bought the Corinthians and everything.
Oh, Qimao.
Talking about the Chinese, Jeff Dyer, former correspondent in China for the Financial Times, and now here for the Financial Times, and former correspondent also in Brazil.
Thanks very much. Question I think for Joao Mauricio. I wonder if you talk a little bit more about the PT. If you take the base economic scenario that you've outlined today, which is resilient inflation, weak growth, weak political leadership, essentially not much better than 2015. If you have 3 more years of the Dilma government like you had last year, that is going to potentially kill the PT for a generation. So at some stage, do you agree with that? Or at some stage, do the incentives of the PT to not block impeachment start to change? Or should we be taking this whole idea of a political pressure for a much more left-wing lurch from the Dilma government more seriously? Talk a bit more about how the PT will play out the next 3 years, assuming that Dilma does stay in power for that time.
Want to start?
No.
About the PT, well, I stand by my previous statement that there's no capital punishment in Brazilian politics. I think that the party will lose in capitals, but will still kind of in the municipal elections, but will still have some power and more at smaller cities. And I think that there is in the next couple of electoral cycles, the party will probably diminish somewhat in size and steer to the left, kind of to reignite its core, the movements, labor movements, etc. I think that's likely to be the case. With respect to the Rousseff's government, I don't think that even though the strategy to survive impeachment will constrict what she can do post-impeachment in terms of policy because of the commitments that she made, I don't think that there's going to be a U-turn to the state capitalism or more unorthodox set of economic policies, but there won't be any meaningful belt tightening either. It's going to be a muddle through, basically, scenario with the government trying to kind of balance between the support of the left with the PT. The PT, they bad with her, worse without her, right? At least they have the presidency, and they know this because Lula faced a similar problem early on, and Canuto knows well. Part of the economic team the first couple of years, where you had the PT complaining about economic policy implemented by Pelosi. So I think the PT has no option, and I think they will complain, they will scream and shout, but I wouldn't take them out of the picture yet. I mean, they survived the mensalão. The PMDB has survived many corruption scandals, and as I said, there's no capital punishment. So,
my experience working in campaigns for PT is that they are the only political party in Brazil in terms of organization, and they really have a party. They have people on the ground. They really have a project. They really have something. That's not going to change. PT has begun in the big cities with the works movement, and then went to the smaller cities in Brazil. Now, PT is very strong in the small cities of Brazil, and people identify PT as the party that works for the poor. And that's there, and that's a legacy. And so I see that they're going to be hurt in the next municipal election. They're going to be hurt in the next presidential election, no doubt about it. But they're gonna be there because they're organized. They have grassroots, and the only thing that they are divided right now because they now feel that the Lula era is over. So they need to rebrand the party with new leadership and etc. But I see PT in the next years are very strong, and because they are organized. Because PSDB is not a party, it's not a political party. PMDB, it's a combination of regional leadership, but PT is a party, and they're going to be there. They're going to have a lot of trouble to get the 50% plus one to be in the next presidential election, no doubt about it. But they are running big states like Minas, like Bahia, and they are very concentrated power on the poor regions and the small cities. So I don't think that they're going to disappear.
Yes, last question, please.
Hi, I'm Connor Sislo with the Asahi Shimbun. I'm sorry I arrived late, so I hope I'm not asking you to rehash too much, but my question is in some ways the inverse of the very first one we had, where instead of the BRICS and China, I wonder if you could evaluate the prospects for Brazilian and U.S. economic cooperation in the next year, and is there a potential for U.S. investment in Brazilian projects, and in a context where China may be less generous, as was said?
Let me say something on this. And I bet it's a similar experience that my colleagues here also have had. I've been flooded since last year by, particularly since last year, by people heretofore never interested in Brazil, but who have become, this has not been translated yet into actual asset purchase and so on, but I had a coffee with someone, for instance, who told me, look, I've been running mutual funds for 30 years, operating with US companies that operate in regulated sectors. And I never ever bought anything in Latin America. But I've been reading the newspapers and I'm deeply interested in knowing what's happening in your country. It's quite interesting. Because many American investors are visualizing a possible outcome of the Lava Jato and so on, the breakdown of the existing stable relationships. This opens many opportunities. Not necessarily at the forefront. It doesn't mean that these people are thinking that they will be the spearhead companies, but they be partners, new partnerships. They are visualizing new winds of opportunity in a system that was heretofore very much stable and closed. So, yes.
Yes, Peter.
I'm glad you asked that question because if I had a closing remark to make, I don't know if we
Do it now.
We went through 2.5 hours without anybody asking anything about the relationship with the United States. And this was almost disregarded completely as the United States. And I think that there's reason for that we're not talking, because the U.S. hasn't tried to play much of a role. I mean, the degree is of, in some ways, the loss of U.S. influence in South America generally is just very remarkable. And I think when the second term began and Levy came in, everyone began to talk about trying to rebuild the relationship with the United States. And Levy has been in Washington, I don't know how many times now, and almost nothing new has happened there. And now we're seeing the same with Macri in Argentina, talking about remaking the U.S. relationship. And we'll see if that gets any further, but there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in contrast. And maybe on the back burner, prices are getting cheaper in Brazil, but I haven't seen any, the last real excitement was back in 2012, 2013, from my sense of it.
Well, let me try to end then in a hopeful note. I think I am of the glass half full school, so I always tend to emphasize the positive, and I see what's happening in Brazil. It's a lot of grief, but a lot of hope also, because if this leads to a more transparent, clean set of political, institutions and the way we run things in Brazil, and I believe that's where we are headed. I believe opportunities for investors of advanced economies will continue, will increase. Actually, little advertisement. We are engaged in that here in terms of connecting companies, connecting institutions that are interested in issues like innovation that require a more open economy in Brazil, and that are interested in, more interaction with American investors. I don't think that the level of investment in American investment in Brazil has dramatically dropped. Companies that are invested are staying there. Some of them are looking for opportunities. They don't see the opportunities because of the internal circumstances, but I think if you think in terms of, and I think that's the way we should think about this crisis in the 3-5 year term, and see that changes will come. This is the time we have budget for this event. I wanted to thank you very much for being here with us, for having joined us, those also that followed us over the internet about Joaquim Levy. Apparently he is staying in Washington now for good. I understand that there was an announcement here today about Joaquim becoming the new chief financial officer of the World Bank, which means that the World Bank will maintain a very good quality in terms of its financial management. And thank you very much. We will announce next Monday a very important event here in mid-February about 50 years. It's about on a book, the presenters, discussants on 50 years of efforts, policies to lower income inequality in Brazil. Is, I think, the most important book. It's called Trajetórias das Desigualdades, published by the State University of São Paulo, and the authors will be here with us, with American experts, to discuss the findings of this book. And stay tuned, we will keep trying to bring interesting discussions about Brazil, Brazil-US relations, and Brazil in the world. Thank you very much, and good morning.